Genesis 38. And it's important for us to remember the context which we're in. So chapter 37, the chapter just before, we're introduced to Joseph's story. Joseph was his father Jacob's favourite son. He was hated by his brothers because of their father's favouritism towards him. Also, Joseph, he had dreams that one day his family would bow before him. And so the hatred from his brothers grew more and more towards him, so much so that they threw him in a pit. They sold him to some Ishmaelite traders on their way to Egypt. And they then deceived their father Jacob by dipping Joseph's robe in goat's blood, leading him to believe that his son Joseph had died and was killed by an animal. Now in chapter 38, we might expect Genesis to continue on with Joseph's life now in Egypt. But instead the attention shifts to Joseph's brother Judah. And this isn't any random interruption. It's not a mistake. It's not, let's just put it in there randomly. But if we think back through Genesis, God had promised Abraham that through his family, all nations would be blessed. That promise then passed on to Isaac and then to Jacob. And now we're left with the question, which of Jacob's sons will God's covenant line continue through? Now, Reuben, his firstborn, had forfeited his position because he slept with his father's concubine. Simeon and Levi had disqualified themselves through their violence at Shechem. And so now the focus falls on Judah. And when we hear the name Judah, what title for Jesus comes to mind? Can anyone shout it out? The Lion of the tribe of Judah. Amen. Now, because of that, because we know Jesus is the Lion of Judah, we might expect Judah to be a man of outstanding character, right? But Genesis 37 has already shown us that it was Judah who was the one who suggested selling Joseph for profit. The story of Jacob's family has been really, really messy up to this point. And when we get into chapter 38, what we're going to see is actually more mess and more dysfunctionality. And that's why I've titled this sermon, The Sin of Man Doesn't Stop God's Plan. The sin of man does not stop God's plan. And I have 3 points. Point 1 is sin is selfish. Point 2, sin sacrifices others. And point 3, sin is shameful. Now there's going to be some crossover with these points throughout the verses. But as we start, I'm going to start with sin is selfish. Now, verse 1 says, it happened at that time that Judah went down from his brothers and turned aside to a certain Adullamite whose name was Hira. Now, it begins by saying, it happened at that time. And we might be thinking, well, what time? What time is this? Well, we see in the previous chapter that Joseph had been sold into Egypt. And so it's at that time now that Judah went down from his brothers. Or in other words, he left his brothers and he moved south. Now, as it says that it is in that time, we can see that this story isn't just randomly placed in between Joseph's story. But if you think about when you watch a movie, you'll have a scene that focuses on certain characters, and then it cuts to another scene, right, with different people. But both scenes are happening at the same time. We're used to seeing that in films, right? Now, that's what we have here. Joseph is in Egypt, and Judah has left his brothers. He's turned aside to a certain Adullamite whose name was Hira. Right? That's Judah's mate. Now, to turn aside means that Judah, right, he hasn't just moved geographically, but spiritually also he's gone, of course. He's left his covenant family. He's settled amongst the Canaanites. And the direction of his life is moving away from God's purposes. And verse 2 says, there Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua. He took her and went into her. Notice it says Judah saw and he took. Saw and he took. We don't see anything of him reasoning or considering his actions, but rather he likes what he sees and he goes for it. It doesn't sound like self-giving love, but rather selfish lust. We're reminded that sin is selfish. He's acting upon what he sees rather than what is right. Judah saw and he took. And when we see those words together in Genesis, it often speaks of immorality. In Genesis chapter 6 verse 2, we see the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. In chapter 12 verse 15, the princes of Pharaoh saw Sarah and took her to Pharaoh. In chapter 34 verse 2, Shechem saw Dinah, Jacob's daughter, and took her and lay with her and humiliated her. But does anyone else know where else in Genesis we see the word saw and took together? Eden. Absolutely, in Eden. Genesis chapter 3 verse 6. Eve saw that the tree was good for food, and she took the fruit and ate. And just as Eve hadn't regarded what God had said, nor does Judah, and he has relations with this Canaanite woman. Now, why is that an issue, we might think? What's so bad about that? Well, Abraham in chapter 24 sends his servant to get a wife for his son Isaac, and he gets the servant to promise that he will not take a wife for his son from the daughters of the Canaanites, but rather from the people of which he came. Now, remember that although Abraham was in the land of Canaan at that time, he only sojourned amongst the people. They hadn't yet completely inhabited it with their people. They were living side by side with the Canaanites. So part of the promise was realized in the sense that they were in the land that God had promised, but they hadn't yet multiplied greatly as God had also promised. This was still early doors at this point. And the Canaanite people, they worshipped multiple gods. They had practices like child sacrifice, cult prostitution, where sexual acts were seen as worship to false gods. They had all kinds of immorality. And so Abraham didn't want Isaac marrying a Canaanite woman. And Isaac's wife, Rebekah, also objected to her sons Jacob and Esau marrying Canaanite women. Although Esau, he did marry a Canaanite woman, and this was frowned upon. Now Judah would have surely known this about his father, about his family, but rather than going with what he knows, he goes with what he sees. He's not thinking about God's covenant with his family. He's thinking about himself. He sees and he takes. Sin is selfish. When we sin, it's down to our selfishness. We have to guard our eyes. May the Lord help us, right? It's what we see that entices us and tempts us, you know. And when we think about this intercultural relationship in this passage, what might be the modern equivalent for us today? You know, today's equivalent is not that we can't marry someone from another culture. Some of us here have. My wife's from Zimbabwe. But rather, it's that we're not to be unequally yoked as a Christian with a non-Christian. You see, that was the issue here. You had God's people intermarrying with a people who were not of God. Now, you do have in some cases where people have gotten married, and the husband and wife at the point of getting married, neither were Christian. And then one of them actually later on becomes a Christian. You might have the woman, she comes to know Jesus, and her husband doesn't yet know Christ. And the Bible encourages actually that you remain in that marriage. That's a different kind of setting there. The marriage covenant has already been sealed. But it's not advisable for a Christian to be going out with a non-Christian. Right? People often say, I don't know if you've ever heard this. I've heard this multiple times. Maybe God will use me to bring them to Jesus. God can certainly save anyone, but Scripture tells believers to not be unequally yoked. I've seen this about 4 or 5 times when actually they think they're going to influence someone into Christ, and they end up being more influenced themselves. So Judah here, he has children with this woman. The firstborn is called the second Onan, and the third is Shelah. And the text tells us that Judah was in Chezib by the time that Shelah was born. He's actually, what's happened here is that he's moved even further away now. By the time his third son is born, he's moved even further out. And verse 6 tells us that Judah took a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. See, it doesn't say that took Tamar for a wife. It's actually, this is a marriage that Judah had arranged. He is the one who took Tamar to be wife. And verse 7 says, but Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. The text doesn't give us any more info on life, but he was wicked in the sight of the Lord. Do you know what's quite interesting? Is actually he might have actually looked like a good person in the sight of others, but he was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and God puts him to death. We see here that sin is very serious. Wickedness is very serious. Now notice how verse 7 reminds us that is Judah's firstborn, right? He was meant to get the firstborn special blessing. And now God has killed him. You think, what's going to happen now? What is happening? This all seems to be going wrong. Well, Judah now turns to his second-born son, Onan, and he says, go into your brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother-in-law to her and raise up offspring for your brother. Offspring for his brother. And you look at that in our culture, you think, hang on a minute. Has just died here, Judah. You're telling Onan to sleep with Er's wife, Tamar? This is crazy. What we see in the Bible is actually this is a practice. It's called levirate marriage, where if a man died without children, his brother was expected to father children with the widow. And this was to continue the deceased brother's family line, where the children would be considered as children of the late brother. So they wouldn't be considered as Onan's children, but rather they'd be considered as Er's children. And it was also, in some cases, actually a way to also protect and provide for the widow who may have been left vulnerable in those times without a husband to support her. And this actually became a law later on. We can find it in Deuteronomy 25. So Judah tells Onan to fulfill his duty by raising up offspring for his brother, not for himself, but for his brother. And verse 9 says, but Onan knew that the offspring would not be his. So whenever he went into his brother's wife, he would waste the semen on the ground so as not to give offspring to his brother. Now, selfishly, Onan was happy to sleep with Tamar. In fact, we see that he did so multiple times. He did this more than once because we see it as it says, whenever he went into his brother's wife, suggesting that this was something that they did often. Right, whenever he went into his brother's wife. But he didn't want the responsibility of raising children for his brother. He wanted the lady, but not the baby. Right? Nothing new under the sun, unfortunately, that we see this today. Unfortunately today, it's actually people often having to raise their own children, not their brothers, you know. It's a really sad thing, but we see that this is the same sins today. And so every time Onan would sleep with Tamar, he would waste his semen on the ground because he did not want to raise children for his brother. But now, I think there's something more to this than him not wanting to raise children. Because had died, Onan was now the oldest brother, right? And so you can imagine that if Er's wife Tamar doesn't have a child through the family line, well, what does that mean? It means that Onan's going to then get the firstborn blessing. So the greatest portion of the inheritance will go to Onan. But if he raises offspring with Tamar for his late brother then his firstborn son, or rather Er's firstborn son through him, will get the inheritance and Onan won't. So you can see here that Onan is thinking selfishly. He's thinking about himself and what he can get whilst still having intercourse with Tamar. And what he did was wicked in the sight of the Lord. So God put Onan to death as well. Now what we have seen in this is that the selfishness of sin is quite like the word sin in how it is spelt. It puts I at the center of everything. And in our selfishness, we don't think about God's will. And we don't think about the impact that it has on others and how it leads to dysfunctionality within our families. And because sin is selfish, it sacrifices others for our pleasure rather than sacrificing ourselves for the love of others. And that's the next point that we move on to, that sin sacrifices others. Now, after the death of Onan, Judah says to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, remain a widow in your father's house till Shelah, my son, grows up. Now that looks like a really nice thing that Judah has said here. He's considering Tamar. It looks like, that when Shelah grows up, she can have him and carry on the Er's line. But actually the text reveals to us why Judah is saying this. It says, for he feared that he would die like his brothers. He feared that Shelah would die like his brothers. So we saw earlier that actually it was the Lord who put and Onan to death because of their own wickedness. But here we see that Judah thinks that it's Tamar's fault. He thinks that this is Tamar's fault that they've died. He basically thinks that she's cursed because both and Onan have been with her, right? And both have died. And now he fears that if Shelah gets with her, he's going to die too. So he sends her away because of this fear, which reveals that he doesn't actually have any intention of ever giving Shelah to Tamar. He basically sacrifices her in that he sends her away. Now remember, it was Judah who took Tamar for his son This was his daughter-in-law that he brought into the family. She was a part of his family. Her husband had died. And Onan, who was to provide offspring to her, had died. And instead of Judah taking care of his daughter-in-law, he sends her away. And it's the closest thing to killing her for his own comfort. She may as well be dead to him as he just gets rid of her. And she's now abandoned to a life of widowhood, probably a life of shame. He hasn't freed her to remarry as he's lied to her in saying that she can have Shelah when he's older. So she can't remarry and she isn't secure in his family. So Tamar, like a sacrifice, is bearing the consequences of their sin. Now she'd gone from being a part of this family to now going back to live with her father. And now her father's now having to bear the consequences of this decision because he now has to support her and provide for her as Judah has rid himself of this responsibility, even though it was he who brought Tamar for her. And she probably actually didn't even have much say in that decision either. Our selfish sacrifices others for our comfort instead of us sacrificing our comfort for others. So just like, this is quite like how Judah had already done this to Joseph with his brothers. Now verse 12 says that in the course of time, the wife of Judah, Shua's daughter, died. When Judah was comforted, he went up to Timnah to his sheep shearers, he and his friend Hira the Adullamite. Now the phrase in the course of time, this means after a long time. And actually it was a very long time that had passed, because now, since Judah sent Tamar back to her father, a lot of time had passed, because we see, as verse 14 tells us, that Shelah had now grown up. So this is a lot of time that had passed by here. And Judah, once he's comforted, he meets up with his pal Hira, who's probably not great company to keep, and they go to Timnah to the sheep shearers. Now, sheep shearing was not just about sheep shearing. This was a seasonal festival. Many people would travel to places like Timnah to get their sheep sheared, to sell the wool. But it was also a time of celebration, where there'd be feasting, there'd be drinking, and there'd be partying. So this is where Judah and Hira have gone. And Tamar is told that Judah was going there. So she takes off her widow's garments. She covers herself with a veil, wrapping herself up so that she is unrecognizable to Judah. And she sits at the entrance of Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah, where the festival is. And what she's doing is she's pretending to be a prostitute. And she does this because she saw that Shelah has grown up and she'd not been given to him like Judah said that he would. So we see now that although Tamar has been wronged, she's not perfect. And we can maybe empathize with Tamar and understand her actions on a human level, right? We can maybe understand it. But she acts deceitfully. And we can't justify wronging people on the basis that they have wronged us, especially in the knowledge of what Christ has done for us. We don't have grounds to stand on in sinning against those who've sinned against us. We can seek justice lawfully, but to deceive and to ensnare is sinful. But what's interesting here is that she waits at the entrance of Enaim. And one of the meanings of that word, enaim, is eyes, funny enough, as we've been thinking about seeing. And we've seen that Judah is someone who acts upon what he sees. Yet here, his eyes are about to be deceived. You see, this is a common pattern in this family that we've seen. Jacob deceived Isaac. Laban deceived Jacob. Judah and his brothers deceived Jacob. Judah deceived Tamar. And now Tamar is about to deceive Judah. So for Tamar to devise this plan, it reveals that she knew what kind of man Judah was, that this was going to entice him. And verse 15 says, Judah saw her. Notice the words. And because her face was covered, he thought that she was a prostitute. So he's seen her, and he's turned to her at the roadside. We think about it, when he's turned to her at the roadside, what does that remind us of? He's turned to her. We see the same word in the very first verse, where Judah went down from his brothers and turned aside to Hira. Again, he's come off the expected course. He goes away from his brothers and turns off course. He goes away from his home in Chezib on the way to Timnah, and he turns off course. And he says to Tamar, let me come into you. The text says that he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law, but Tamar knew that this was her father-in-law. This was all part of the plan. And although her actions will sacrifice his rep, which really is his own doing, her motive is not to just get one back at Judah for the sake of it, but rather to have offspring from the family line, like what was promised to her but had been denied. And she says to Judah, what will you give me that you may come into me? And he says to her, I will send you a young goat from the flock. But Tamar thinks ahead, because she thinks about when she's pregnant, she's going to need something to prove that this child is Judah's. And a goat is not distinct enough to serve as reliable evidence that this child is his. And so she responds by accepting this offer, but only if he gives her a pledge until he sends it. She wants him to provide some personal items as a deposit first. And he asks her, what pledge shall I give you? And she replies by saying, your signet and your cord and your staff that is in your hand. Now these items, they would serve as reliable evidence, as a signet was like personal identification. Prominent people would have their own signet, which was a personal stamp, right? And they would often wear them on a cord like a necklace. And staffs were used by shepherds, but they were also sometimes held by men as an item symbolizing authority and leadership. So these serve as identification. Like it would be like if we were to leave our driver's license or our passport with someone. And Judah gives her these important items as he is taken by lust and his reason is clouded. Now, when we are moved by strong desires, we make foolish choices. You know those strong desires, sometimes the urge to do something, or sometimes strong desire when you're angry and you act out in anger and then you make a foolish choice. I think back as a teenager. I used to sell items so that I could buy drugs as a teenager, right? And out of that desire, I would sell things for a lot less than their value so that I could feed this desire with a temporal fix, and then later I'd no longer have those things. And I would regret those decisions. I would regret those decisions, wishing that I didn't get rid of those things. But clouded by my desire, I would make foolish choices. And Judah giving her these things, he then has sex with her, and she becomes pregnant. Now, what Judah has done is shameful. He has been immoral. He has knowingly slept with who he thought was a prostitute. He's done that knowingly, and that is shameful enough. But unknowingly, he has slept with his daughter-in-law. Which brings us to our next point. Sin brings shame. Now, Tamar goes away. She takes off her veil. She doesn't want anyone else thinking that she's a prostitute. She was only doing this so that she could conceive by Judah. And so she puts back on her garments of widowhood. And in verse 20, we see Judah is keeping his word. Right? He's sending Hira to bring the young goat to Tamar. Oh, we might read and think, well, hey, that's a good thing. Judah's doing some good here. He's honoring his word here at least. But then we remember that he's doing that because he needs his important items back. Right? He's got to give the goats if he wants his signet, his cord, and his staff. And his friend here, Hira, he's looking for this supposed prostitute, and he doesn't find her. And so he begins to ask the locals, where is the cult prostitute? And they respond by saying, no cult prostitute has been there. Now notice that Judah's friend is asking for the whereabouts of a cult prostitute. But when Judah saw her earlier, it says that he thought she was a prostitute. And the Hebrew words for prostitute here are two different words. There's a distinction between the prostitute and the cult prostitute. You see, Judah saw her and thought that she was a prostitute in a general sense. But his friend is asking for the cult prostitute. And cult prostitutes were women who would have sex with men as worship to the Canaanite gods. But cult prostitutes were seen as more honorable than just a regular prostitute. You know, people would think at least they're doing it as worship, right? It's seen as honorable, whereas a general prostitute was not seen as honorable at all. And so you can imagine that to cover his shame, Judah makes out that she was a cult prostitute rather than just a common prostitute that he thought she was. And that's what we do with our sin. We try to make it sound less bad than what it is. And now Judah's friend returns to him saying that he hasn't found her and the locals haven't seen her either. And so he resorts to letting her keep the items, otherwise they'll be laughed at. You know, the fact that people would laugh shows that it's shameful. But when we're lured by sinful desire, we're willing to do things that we wouldn't want people to know about. Just as Judah here, he doesn't want people to know. Now 3 months pass, and Judah is told that Tamar, his daughter-in-law, has been immoral. And she's even pregnant by immorality. And Judah says, bring her out and let her be burned. Now, you can imagine that this is around the time that Tamar is starting to have a bump. Right? People are noticing. It's visible that she's pregnant. And Judah is told. And suddenly, he now seems to care about what is going on in his daughter-in-law's life. It's funny that. Judah calls for her to be burned, yet he's also been immoral. The only difference is that Tamar can't hide it. And that's not her intention anyways. She's planned to become pregnant by him. But other people's sin is often worse than our own. And what we are quick to point out in others is often the same sin in our own hearts that we're not able to cover up, or that we try to cover up, that someone else might not be able to, or it might look slightly different. And Judah again, he's willing to sacrifice Tamar. Maybe because she's now brought shame on his family. Yet so selfish is he that he calls for her to be burned, that would kill not only Tamar, but the babies that she's carrying, as we later see that she has twins. But Tamar, she's a step ahead of him. She knew that her being pregnant would put her life at risk. And this is why she took the items earlier, as she now produces this signet, the cord, and the staff. And she says, please identify whose these are. Judah is then convicted. And he says, she's more righteous than I, since I did not give her to my son, Shelah. And the text says that he did not know her again. He did not have intercourse with her again. And Judah is not saying that Tamar is righteous in the sense that she's without sin. No one is without sin. But rather what he's saying is that his sin is worse than hers. Sometimes in judging others, we may condemn ourselves. And Judah here recognizes his sin and confesses that he did not give Shelah to Tamar. Now, verse 27 tells us that when the time of labor came, there were twins in Tamar's womb. And when she was in labor, one put out a hand, and the midwife tied a scarlet thread on his hand, saying, this one came out first. The scarlet thread marked the firstborn. But that, what was meant to be the firstborn baby, draws back his hand, and his brother comes out instead. And Tamar says, what a breach you have made for yourself. Therefore his name was called Perez, which means breach. And then his brother comes out with the scarlet thread on, and his name is called Zerah. Now, we see in that story that it is such a mess. It's a dysfunctional family full of sin. Right? But what we see is that even all of this couldn't stop God's plan. You see, all of this was unfolding while Joseph was in Egypt. And God's plan was already in motion. You see, through Joseph, the entire family would eventually be brought to Egypt, where they would grow into a great nation as promised to Abraham. So that later, under Moses, they would be led into the promised land through Joshua, also as promised to Abraham, and then inhabit the land. You see, God was orchestrating every detail. Imagine this, right? If Judah and his family had stayed where they were, they likely would have continued to assimilate with the Canaanite culture and lose their distinct identity altogether. But God, in his wisdom, preserved them, not only for their own sake, but to carry forward his ultimate plan. Earlier, we thought about how Judah's name is the title of our Lord Jesus, being the Lion of the tribe of Judah. Now, what did Judah ever do to earn such an honor as that? Can you believe this? Like, what did he do to earn that honor? Nothing at all. Nothing at all. And yet, his name is in the title, the Lion of the tribe of Judah. Judah was a wretched sinner. And we can look at Judah and judge him. We may think that his family looks like something out of Jeremy Kyle. Yet these are the people who God chose. And you may not have sinned in the same way as Judah. But how often do we put ourselves first? How often do we sacrifice others for our own selfish desires? And those people are often the ones who are closest to us. How often do we do shameful things and try to make it sound less sinful than it really is, and yet highlight other people's sin as greater than our own? You see, we're all sick with sin. We deserve to be killed like and Onan. But that is the very reason why Jesus, the Lion of Judah, came to earth for us. That is the very reason. Remember that God made a promise to Abraham in that he would inherit the land, he would have many descendants, and that through his offspring, all nations would be blessed. And this is fully realized in Jesus. Jesus is the Lion of Judah who was born through Judah's family line. In earthly terms, actually, he came through Perez's line, the breach, the child who was born to Tamar through Judah. And Jesus isn't selfish, but rather he is selfless in that he didn't stay in heaven, but he left heaven for us. And Jesus sacrificed himself on the cross for us. He sacrificed himself and he took our shame. He was treated as if he lived shamefully so that we could be forgiven and made righteous. He does the opposite. We think our sin is selfish and sacrifices others and shameful. Jesus is selfless. He sacrifices himself and takes our shame. You see, the sin of humanity doesn't stop God's plan, because God's plan in Christ is to save humanity from sin that we may know him. We've got no bragging rights. It's by grace that Judah is given such honor. You know, some may think, how can God show grace to him? How can God show grace to Judah? Well, that is what grace is. Grace is given to people who do not deserve it. May we remember how greatly in need we are of God's grace. And may we give thanks to God that he would step into our dysfunctionality, the dysfunctionality of the world, to save us. And you might be sitting here and be reminded of your sin. You might hear the enemy accusing you of past sins. But what we see here is that God uses sinful people even, and it doesn't stop his plan. Don't be debilitated by the truth that you're a sinner, but seek to glorify God in the service for the undeserved great grace that he's shown to you through Jesus. You know, I've highlighted sin a lot in this sermon, but actually what I've hoped for is that might show to you even more how great God's grace is, that he chooses and he uses sinners like Judah and he even honors them. Amen.